Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is languish. Let's take a moment to look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you are likely to hear languish used is to mean to grow weak or feeble. So this first definition certainly has kind of a negative picture that comes to my mind. So something losing strength. That might be a helpful way to remember that. A second way you'll hear the verb languish used is to mean to fail to make progress or to fail at being successful at something. So again, another sort of strong negative meaning to this verb. A third way to use the verb languish is to mean to suffer from being forced to remain in an unpleasant place or situation. So again, you can see all three of these definitions make me think of kind of being stuck somewhere. That third definition, which that feeling is certainly is negative. The feeling of not making progress or becoming weaker, also very negative. You should know that the verb languish is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing to form languishing. The past tense and participle forms of this verb can be made by adding ed. Our base verb, languish, okay, ends in an unvoiced sound. And that means when I add the past tense ending, I'm going to make a T sound. So it should sound like this: languished, languished. Okay. Now there are a few phrasal verbs connected to this verb. The first one we'll discuss is to languish in. So when we use this, we're generally describing an action where someone or something is spending time in a particular place while their health weakens or perhaps their spirit, kind of their feelings and emotions, kind of go downhill. An example of this might be, how long has she been languishing in the hospital? So this particular sentence might be describing a situation where a patient isn't improving. In fact, maybe their condition is getting worse. They're not able to get out of bed any longer, or something else that indicates their health is not as strong. A second way to use languish in is to mean to be forgotten, ignored, or neglected in a particular place. So here, neglected, like not paying attention, and to a sort of serious detriment, right? So that someone isn't getting something they really need. An example of this might be, how many people are languishing in Turkey? There was a horrible, horrible earthquake several weeks ago, and I know personally, right, I was reading a lot about it, I was hearing a lot about it early on in the days and even maybe the first week or two after. But it can at times feel like, oh my goodness, we've forgotten the poor people there. We're not giving them the same kind of attention, and they certainly still need it because of how massive and devastating the earthquake was. A third way to use languish in is to mean to be overwhelmed or debilitated by some emotional, physical, or psychological state. An example of this might be, he languished in grief for 2 years after his wife passed. So here we're describing someone just overwhelmed by this feeling of grief, of sadness that, in this case, his spouse has been lost and is no longer with us. So maybe this person wasn't really able to work or care for themselves. Maybe other things in their life were getting ignored because of this really, really strong emotion. The last phrasal verb we'll discuss today is to languish over. This generally means that we desire or we grieve someone or something so intensely that it leads us to becoming depressed. An example of this might be, don't languish over your ex. right? Here's a command, but usually a helpful thing to hear, right? Don't be so focused on your ex-girlfriend, boyfriend, spouse, what have you, right? So much so, right, that you fall into a depression. Okay. Now let's continue using our verb of the day, languish, in a couple of different verb tenses. Today we're going to practice and review the simple present and the present perfect. We'll start with the simple present. We use this verb tense to talk about our habits and routines. We also use it to discuss facts. And when I go to write sentences in the simple present, I need to pay attention to my subject. If my subject is I, you, we, or they, then I can just use the base verb as it is. No suffixes, no special endings to the word. Okay? And that's going to be my structure in the affirmative. But if my subject is he, she, or it, then I need to add an es to the end of this verb. Okay? An example of this might be, the company's stock always languishes in the first quarter. Sometimes you'll hear languish used in connection to finances, the stock market, right? So we're tying this back to the second definition, that something isn't making progress, it's not being successful. So here, like the price isn't going up, might be going down, it might just not be making any progress at all. And stock here, it would be like saying it, and that's why you see an es on the end of my verb. Let's look at making simple present sentences in the negative now. Again, I pay attention to my subject. If the subject is I, you, we, or they, I use do not and then the base verb, or don't and the base verb. But if my subject is he, she, or it, I use does not and then the base verb, or doesn't and the base verb. So no es on the end of the verb in the negative. Here's an example. She doesn't languish in what once was. She's living her life with purpose and intention. So I borrowed this sentence, made a couple quick edits to keep it a little shorter, but it was describing someone who has faced many challenges. This particular person isn't falling into that depression, even though there might be things the person could grieve or mourn in this case. Now, let's take a look at making a yes or no question. To do this, I start with do or does, whichever form matches my subject, and that subject comes next, and then I use the base verb. So again, no es on the end of the verb in my yes or no question. Here's another example. Do your new program ideas just languish with your boss? So here that might be kind of, they just get stuck, right? They aren't making progress. They're not moving forward at all. The ideas just kind of sit and go nowhere. Now let's talk about the present perfect. We use this verb tense to describe actions that started in the past and continue into the present. We also use it to describe actions that occurred in the past, but at an unknown point. So many times this gets called the indefinite past. So we don't know, was it last week? Was it last year? Was it 10 years ago? And it might not matter. To make present perfect sentences, we need to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, I'm going to use have and then the participle form the verb. If my subject is he, she, or it, I'm going to use has and then the participle form of the verb. Let's take a look at an example sentence. Inmates with mental illnesses have languished in prison without trial or treatment. Again, I borrowed this sentence from a newspaper article talking about people being forgotten, being neglected in a particular state prison system. They're not getting medical treatment. They're not facing a trial, right? They're just sort of stuck in this spot. Okay. Now let's talk about negative present perfect. Like the pattern we've been observing here, we start with our subject. Okay. Then we use have or has, depends on what that subject is. Then we use not, and then the participle form of the verb. You might also hear haven't and then the participle, or hasn't and then the participle. Okay? An example here. The actress hasn't languished wondering what to do after winning her Oscar. Right? So here we're again sort of suggesting that someone is still being successful. They're still making progress. Here, they're still making movies or doing other projects that might kind of motivate and excite them. Now, let's talk about the present perfect in yes or no questions. To do this, I start with have or has, then I have my subject, and then the participle form, the verb. Here's another example. Has that bill just languished in the Senate? Okay, so here, this could be that neglected and forgotten meaning again, or we can tie it back to that idea of like it's not making progress, it's not being discussed by or debated, it's not being brought before a committee, it's just stuck there. Now, let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb languish. The first word we'll discuss is the noun languishment. This could be describing a state of weakness or the loss of strength. An example might be, have you determined what has caused the patient's languishment? Right, so here, again, this might be connected to someone who's been in the hospital, not getting better, in fact, maybe getting worse. A second way the noun languishment gets used is to refer to a feeling of deep sadness. An example of this, the delights of love end in languishment and dejection. Okay, so I think a perhaps slightly hurt, if not very hurt person, wrote this sentence. So kind of this idea of like, oh, I'm in love, but it's going to end in sadness or a feeling of dejection. Another related word you might encounter is languishing, used as an adjective. So many times when you hear it used as an adjective, it means failing to make progress or failing to become successful. An example of this. How can teachers help languishing students? So again, here's this idea of like somebody who's just stuck, not moving forward. The last word we'll look at today is the adverb languishingly. This is describing something that is being done in a way that fails to make progress or fails to be successful. An example of this. The team's languishingly abysmal record certainly means there won't be any postseason. Okay? So in many sports, there's sort of a regular season with a series of games or matches, and the top performing teams move on to a postseason or like a championship style competition. This sentence is describing a team who isn't making progress, who isn't being successful. It's another way to say they've been losing quite a lot or quite often. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.